So, verse 15 of Job, this is when one of Job's friends, Eliphaz, is going to answer him. If you remember the last chapter, Job had this open conversation as if he's talking with God to an extent. Eliphaz is going to chime in as part of this discussion that Job is having, and bring some his perspective to this. So let's read this to go through Eliphaz's perspective on what might be happening to Job, and then we can discuss in the comments whether we agree with Eliphaz or the concepts he puts forth here. So verse 1, then answered Eliphaz the Temanite and said, should a wise man utter vain knowledge and fill his belly with the east wind? Should he reason with unprofitable talk, or with speeches wherewith he can do no good? Yea, thou castest off fear and restrainest prayer before God. For thine mouth uttereth thine iniquity, and thou choosest the tongue of the crafty. Thine own mouth condemneth thee, and not I, yea, thine own lips testify against thee. So Eliphaz is basically saying, look, this is pointless conversation, Job. You're having this conversation as if you're talking with God about what's going on and the resurrection that's coming and things, and why do you have the problems you do? But you're basically, Eliphaz is telling Job, dude, Job, you're pious, you're selfish. What's the deal here? Why are your language is betraying you? And I think this is a little bit of a challenge here that we see sometimes. And this is something for us all to watch out for. Sometimes things happen where we impose our ideas on others, and we think we know what's going on with that person, when in fact we might not. And I believe that's what Eliphaz is doing here, is he's looking at this from a more 1 + 1 = 2 type of a concept, in that he is saying basically, if you remember from the earlier chapters when Eliphaz was talking, it's basically, Job, people have bad problems because they were sinners. God is punishing you, and God is punishing you. God punishes sinners, therefore you are a sinner. And so he's looking at this from this standpoint, basically, with Job. And Job's been telling him, no, I don't think that's quite right. That doesn't make a lot of sense in my mind. And so that's part of this underlying discussion that's happening here. Verse 6, verse 7, art thou the first man that was born, or wast thou made before the hills? There is a really good question. A really good question. So Eliphaz is basically saying, did you live before? Are you that old? Were you the first man? Were you like Adam? Basically, were you born? Have you been around this long time? What is this? Job is presenting a little bit more of an eternal perspective of things. Okay, and Eliphaz doesn't quite understand this eternal perspective of things, basically, that Job is telling, because Job is saying, you knew who I was before. I've lived on this earth, and now I'm going to be resurrected and living again. And Eliphaz is going, what are you talking about? This is a foreign thing for him, basically. Verse 8, hast thou heard the secret of God, and dost thou restrain wisdom to thyself? What knowest thou that we know not? What understandest thou which is not in us? With us are both the gray-headed and the very aged men, much elder than thy father. Are the consolations of God small with thee? Is there any secret thing with thee? Why doth thine heart carry thee away, and what do thine eyes wink at? That thou turnest thy spirit against God, and lettest such words go out of thy mouth. So Eliphaz obviously is coming from this from, a more worldly perspective, not a eternal perspective. Mentioning here, do you know something, Job, that we don't know? Are you understanding the ways of God in that are different than what we understand? So Eliphaz is trying to tease this out, this difference. He realizes that Job is seeing things differently than Eliphaz is. So Eliphaz is trying to get this to come out in the conversation. And he's going to kind of come against some of the things that Job said in the last chapter, right here, starting in verse 14. What is man that he should be clean? And he which is born of a woman, that he should be righteous. Behold, he putteth no trust in his saints, meaning God, he, okay? Yea, the heavens are not clean in his sight. How much more abominable and filthy is man, which drinketh iniquity like water? So, Eliphaz's philosophy here, and this is not an uncommon one, is that and this is the challenge, is when people have a hard time understanding who God is, when we don't have things to help us understand God, we tend to try to understand God through our mortal perspective. You can see this tons in a lot of ancient philosophies. The Greeks, with their gods, they try to understand God from a mortal perspective. And so a lot of times these cultures will have an idea or a concept of God that is based on the frailties of mortality, uh, like fears, the gods having passions, and and because we don't understand the things of God. Here's the thing to think about: if you're on this level of understanding about something, and somebody else is on this level of understanding about something, this person cannot talk about this at this level. To understand this level, they have to start from here and then try to understand it. And so they can only explain it from where they're at. And this is the same with us and our relationship with God. This is why our relationship with God is so important. Because if we don't understand God, then we're going to use our context to try to understand God. And that's inappropriate. We're going to get what the Romans and the Greeks and them have, basically, is where they have gods that are almost like just humans with superpowers. Basically, they can make mistakes, they can have problems. Gods can have affairs and cause issues and other things. They get mad and they get jealous and all these things. And we do see in the scriptures that there are references to God having feelings, having those emotions. But the thing is in order for us to understand God, we have to understand where He is coming from. This is one of the things that's so important with revelation, because without understanding that there is a God and that He is there, we can never understand truly Him. So this is a huge contrast. If we go back in the Old Testament to the time of Moses, we see this stand out, because back then, again, we're in the Egyptian philosophy. Egyptian philosophy is not that different from Greek's. In fact, what's fascinating, if you didn't realize this, a lot of Greek culture actually comes from studying Egyptians. The Egyptian culture is very much older than the Greeks. And the Greeks learned most science and a lot of philosophy and things from the Egyptians. And so the Egyptians had this concept of there's multiple gods. They hate each other, they kill each other, they have these problems and things. There's a movie that came out several years ago, Gods of Egypt, I believe is what it's called. If you're not familiar with Egyptian religion, go watch that movie, Gods of Egypt. It's a relatively current perspective of gods, Egyptian gods and their philosophies and different things. But it helps you to understand this concept. So in Egypt, they tried to understand gods through the perspective of men. And that's why they get many different gods, and they get gods that are basically just superhumans. For really is what it comes down to. They're just superhumans. So that's where they have that, because they're coming from understanding God from a mortal perspective. We need to understand God from a godly perspective to really understand Him, and that's the difference. Is Egyptians knew God from a moral perspective, but then comes along Moses, and Moses meets God through this burning bush experience that he has, and he realizes God is much bigger and better and amazing than any Egyptian god, and He is very real, and He reveals Himself to Moses, and He helps Moses understand Him. He calls Moses my son. Can you imagine that if a God said my son or my daughter to you? How does that completely changes how you think about yourself, because now you understand a relationship with God. God is our parent. And there's lots of assumptions that go along with that, because if God is my parent, I have divine heritage. That means I have divine inside me. That changes your outlook and your perspective. So understanding who God is and our relationship with Him completely transforms our self-identity and our ability to do things. the potential we have is phenomenal. If we are gods in embryo, if we are the sons and daughters of God, like Moses found out, we have phenomenal potential. And if it's one thing we learn from all the stories in the Old Testament, is showing how much God loves his people. Not just the Jews, the people who are born and raised through the literal family of Abraham, but the people who follow him, keep his commandments. This is so important for us to understand. And the more we understand our relationship and connection with God, the better we can understand ourselves better and what's happening. And so that's the challenge here, is Eliphaz does not have that perspective. Okay. Job does. Job is looking at this from a more eternal perspective of the greater plan of happiness, if we could call it. And Eliphaz doesn't quite have that grasp and understanding. So let's get back in here and talk about this a little bit more to continue on. He says here in, let's see, verse 17, I will show thee, hear me, that which I have seen I will declare, which wise men have told from their fathers and have not hid it. So now he's saying, I'm going to tell you something, Job, and he's now reinforcing where he learned this from, the wise men of the ancients. This is where I've learned this from. So he's qualifying what he's about to say. Unto whom alone the earth was given, and no stranger passed among them. The wicked man travaileth with pain all his days, and the number of years is hidden to the oppressor. A dreadful sound is in his ears. In prosperity the destroyer shall come upon him. So he's talking about, Eliphaz is saying basically this concept is, the wicked don't understand that they are the cause of their own problems, basically. And that the destroyer, which is an invisible force, like an angel, that is causing them problems, not to just because, but because they are a wicked person. Verse 22, he believeth not that he shall return out of darkness, and he is waited for of the sword. He wandereth abroad for bread, saying, where is it? He knoweth that the day of darkness is ready at his hand. Trouble and anguish shall make him afraid. They shall prevail against him as a king ready to the battle. For he stretcheth out his hand against God, and strengtheneth himself against the Almighty. He runneth upon him, even upon his neck, upon the thick bosses of his bucklers. Those are the shields and things as well. He is making himself more powerful or more influential. He is focusing on himself and disregarding or discrediting God in here, basically. Because he this is verse 27, because he covereth his face with his fatness, and maketh collops of fat on his flanks. So this is getting, if you're fat, you have abundance. You have a lot. I mean, think about it. Back then, 1 meal a day was normal. If you got 1 meal a day every day, you were decent. If you got 2 meals a day, you were doing pretty good back then. So if you have the ability to gain a lot of fat, which we know now in the science of nutrition means you are consuming more calories than you're burning. Considering they walk everywhere, if you're fat, that means you have abundance of resources to help you to have food, animals and grains, and sweets and other things to the more expensive things that don't just naturally grow. And you have a job that allows you to be sedentary. You sit. You're not working the fields. You're doing other types of jobs so you can gain fat. Verse 20, and he dwelleth in desolate cities and in houses which no man inhabiteth, which are ready to become heaps. He shall not be rich, neither shall his substance continue, neither shall he prolong the perfection thereof upon the earth. He shall not depart out of darkness, and the flame shall dry up his branches, and by the breath of his mouth shall he go away. Let not him that is deceived trust in vanity, for vanity shall be his recompense. It shall be accomplished before his time, and his branch shall not be green. He shall shake off his unripe grape as the vine, and shall cast off his flower as the olive. For the congregation of hypocrites shall be desolate, and fire shall consume the tabernacles of bribery. They conceive mischief, and bring forth vanity, and their belly prepareth deceit. So Eliphaz's philosophy is, again, pretty simple. People are tempted and destroyed because of wickedness. If you're wicked, you have bad things happen to you. You think your life is good. You can wish it to be good all you want, but because of your wickedness, God has set the forces against you, and you will try to improve yourself, but there's nothing you can do about it. Your destiny is set. And so this is the challenge coming from Eliphaz's perspective, basically. So let's go into the next chapter to see Job's response to this conversation.